Greetings and welcome to the final of the Transforming Assessment series for 2015. We will be back, of course, for 2016. The session today is around using learning analytics data for teachers and an introduction to a tool that will complete the loop. Our presenters today are Professor Gregor, Linda Corrin, and Paula Barba from the University of Melbourne. So Gregor, whoever, please begin.
This talk with my colleagues who, of course, are just sitting in the room next to me, it's Linda Corrin and Paula Barba, and really talking about a project that we've been working on for about 12 months now, which is called Completing the Loop, and the title of the talk is Providing Meaningful Learning Analytics to Teachers. How do I go through the project? There's a team here at the University of Melbourne, Linda and Paula and David and Raoul, but also we've got a team with Laurie Lockyer and Susie from Macquarie University, Shane Dawson and Scott Copeland from the University of South Australia. I do want to acknowledge particularly today with today's presentation that Anisha Macquarie has been assisting us with programming the tool. We've got a very expert panel on the reference group who's been supporting the project, and as I said, the whole project we'll be presenting today is funded from the Office of Learning and Teaching here in the Australian context. Matthew. So I'm just going to provide some background to the project, give you an idea of what we did across the phases and how the project's structured, and then Linda is going to take you through a demonstration with some screenshots of what we've actually developed thus far. As Matthew said, we're more than happy to take questions and interruptions as we go along, so use that chat box down below, and Paula will hopefully triage those if we can't see them while we're talking, but as I say, feel free to interrupt. So as I'm sure many of you know who are online, the field of learning analytics is really grown in the last 5 years and has really risen in prominence in many sectors, and particularly in higher education. And I think that part of the reason for that is the potential for learning analytics to enhance teaching and learning practices in higher education. And part of the reason for that is that it provides some empirical basis for the ways in which we think about the design of learning and teaching and assessment online and how we deliver learning and teaching assessment online. So for us, the basic premise of the project, as sort of indicated by this slide, is that the students who are working and beavering away with the kinds of tasks and activities that we set for them in online and blended learning environments, and those tasks and activities that we set for them create scads and scads of data that could potentially be used for provision to teachers to try and inform them about how students are using the tasks and activities that they're engaging with. And one of the questions that we have is, what's the best way in which we can manipulate and present that data to teaching staff? So streams and streams of data coming out of learning management systems or other systems, enterprise learning and teaching systems. How can we manipulate that data so that it's in a usable and actionable format for teachers? And then a second question, which is represented by the clock up there, is how can we do that in a way that is timely for teachers so that they'll have an opportunity to respond to the data in a timely way so that they can respond to it and potentially implement something or change their practice in classrooms online or with the ways in which they design online activities for students. Because I think that one of the things about learning analytics is that often, if you look through the literature historically, people download huge data files and then manipulate them and then find something out about what has happened in their class or in their research and evaluation of a particular class. And the class is long gone. Any action that may come out of doing your analysis and finding out what you find out about the ways in which students are engaging with learning and assessment tasks is found out well after students have sort of exited the course or the subject or the unit or the program. So that's one of the things that we're interested in, ways in which we could provide timely feedback to staff so that that is actionable in their day-to-day courses. Next slide, I think. So the overarching aims of the project, as I sort of indicated, is how to deliver useful learning analytics to academic teachers in higher education, and in doing that, understand how teaching staff can interpret, apply and action those analytics. So it's one thing to deliver them to them, but in this project we're very interested in real world cases of the ways in which academic staff are actually able to apply them. And so there's the title of the project, and also the presentation is that the overarching aim of the project was to complete the loop. So provide these data from students' interactions back to teachers. Matt. So the project has 3 phases where we'll go into some detail about those, and we'll spend a bit of time particularly on the first and the second phase. In the first phase, what we did is we explored the problems and scenarios that teachers across the project team, across the universities that were involved in the project, explored the problems and scenarios that teachers faced in their everyday lives. And we did this by conducting 12 interviews with teaching academics. And what we really sought to investigate in those interviews was what was the pedagogical intent behind the subject or the unit, across the 12 weeks of what they were trying to teach their students. What were the kinds of technologies that they used to support those activity and learning objectives? What were the kinds of educational problems that they routinely faced within their classes? And what were the ways in which analytics might be able to respond to the needs and wants that these teaching staff have? I think the next slide then. And when we did the analysis of those interviews or case studies, those interviews with staff, and this was published in the Escalate paper that was on the previous screen, what we found is that the participants had fairly basic requirements when it came to how they might use learning analytics that they were able to gather and harness from their courses. And so we went into and I'll talk about this in a little bit of time, we went into the project thinking, well, we could really use analytics to uncover patterns of behaviour in rich learning tasks that were set for students. But what we really found was that staff had fairly basic requirements about learning analytics. So simple things like how often students were logging on, how often were students downloading critical resources that the academic might have spent a lot of time investing in and putting up. So relatively simple requirements. Linda or Paula, is there anything you wanted to add at that stage?
No, sounding good so far.
Okay, Matt, next slide. And as I said before, most of the requests and many of the requests that we found across those 12 cases were simply about student engagement, and that some of the problems that the teaching staff were highlighting were not really related to learning analytics. They were related to broader levels of student. How do we know students are turning up to our face-to-face classes was one of the things. But when they were related to learning analytics, as I said, they're relatively simple statistics about student engagement and frequency of access to resources. Next slide, thanks, Matt. We also found, which is a sort of the other side of the coin to this, is that, again, we went in with fairly lofty ambitions about how we would use learning analytics to uncover rich interactions with fairly sophisticated design of online learning tasks and activities and assessments. But what we found is that few of the participants in our sample, in those 12 cases, really made use of really deeply interactive online activities. And that really limited the kinds of data that we would actually draw out of any kind of system or tool we used. So that's something we'll return to in a second. Matt? So a clear thing that came up consistently in the interviews was that teaching staff wanted to use, and this is quite a reasonable thing, I think, use data that came out of learning management systems or other enterprise teaching and learning systems and relate that to other data sources that they may have collected, whether that's the data that they themselves have collected or more institutional surveys, such as the student evaluation surveys, which are common among the higher education sector here and around the world, and often the bane of academics' existence. So it was one way to look at the way in which staff were using different data sources to evaluate things. There was a clear concern expressed among many of the participants about the ways in which they would be able to interpret the data that came out of these systems. So we made a fairly sophisticated protocol in our interviews where we exposed the interviewees to a range of different types of dashboards and ways in which data could be presented in tabular form, or types of outputs from learning analytics systems. And many participants were concerned that they would have difficulty interpreting the data in ways that would enable them to action those data in some way. And they also pointed to the need that in order to do this for themselves and also more systematically across the institution, there was a great need for training or professional development in this area. Matt, go back one, yep. And again, one of the things that routinely comes up in research and evaluation studies to busy academics was the time and the busyness of the schedule of teaching research staff in universities, how much time it would take to collect, analyse and develop actions based on learning analytics data, particularly if you've got other things that you're doing. And also if there's not a clear payoff in a way, if it's more exploratory, or if you're not entirely sure about the ways in which the learning analytics data would eventually impact on either the student experience or the ways in which you were thinking about your own teaching and learning. So after exploring those teaching and learning problems with those teaching staff, I might pause there and see if there's anybody who wants to ask a question at that point in time, which we can respond to. So I'll just give a couple of seconds there for anyone to type something in.
Linda, did you want to mention something since you popped up your hand very briefly?
I did that on purpose to try and get Gregor's attention. I just wanted to highlight from that last slide that a lot of the concern was around the fact that if by using some sort of learning analytics tool, academics were able to identify a number of students who were struggling or needed some kind of intervention, they were quite worried about workload implications that would have for being able to address all of those problem students. So that was definitely something that came up in a number of those interviews, if not all of them actually.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And again, this sort of speaks to the concerns. The academics, continuing as one of the deans in our institutions says all the time, are we going to continue to just layer on more activities on academic staff and teaching staff without any really recognition of how many times we're layering things on? So with the first phase broadly out of the way, what the intent of the project was to explore those problems and scenarios and the ways in which analytics could impact on the practice of teaching staff. And the second phase was to use what we'd learnt from that first phase to develop a web-based analytics tool. And I want to pause for a second and just think about the challenges that came up, which were really about a mismatch of our expectations going into the project and where we got to after the first phase. So as I sort of kept saying previously in the first 20 minutes, if we went into this project with this idea of having relatively sophisticated analytics responding to fairly sophisticated learning designs, that we would uncover patterns of learning behaviour that would help student learning. What we found that really is that fairly rudimentary learning designs, subject designs were being used by staff, and they were after relatively basic analytics. And so a challenge for us was to sort of recalibrate the project a little bit and work out how we could design a tool that was not in the lofty ambition of where we started, but responding to what would be the predominant way in which staff across institutions, certainly in Australia, would use learning management systems for the provisions of the resources for fairly basic discussion lists and the like, and the way in which analytics could respond to those relatively basic kinds of scenarios, teaching and learning scenarios and learning design, and also the relatively basic needs of staff. So that was one of the things that we had to sort of recalibrate. The second thing was in the intent of the project was to try and not just provide behavioural data back to staff in a sort of fairly blank way, but we needed to, the intent of the project was to try and tie the data that we were collecting through this tool that we were going to develop, tie those data back to the teaching and learning context and the pedagogical intent of the task. So we needed to think carefully through the ways in which we could construct a tool that accommodated both those sophisticated and basic sort of routines, but also responded to the diversity of pedagogical intents that existed out there in the sector. Now, we knew that was going to be a challenge from the start, but it was made clear through those interviews. And finally, the interviews told us that we would need to provide and think carefully about the way we constructed this tool, so it would be a relatively easy experience in terms of staff access to data and seeing what it said, but also recognising that outside the tool we probably needed to think about support for analysis and interpretation. Linda, do you or Paula, do you want to say anything at that stage?
Well, I think this is pretty spot on where challenges of the project were, and basically to provide the support for to deal with that challenge of trying to provide something a little bit more sophisticated, and not just because they were asking for basic analytics to just provide basic analytics, but also try to provide more meaningful analytics, so a little bit more sophisticated that they were asking for, and provide the support to enable them to actually interpret and make sense of that. I remember having interesting conversations about that on that stage of the project.
Yes. Linda, there's a question there from Megan about the disciplines or fields of studies for the 12 participants. I don't know if you want to respond to that one.
Yes, we classified the 12 groups, or the 12 case studies, into 3 groups of arts, sciences and the professions, and we had 4 cases from each of those areas. So we had everyone from property law people through to accountants, through to marine biologists, historians, and a whole sort of range. So we were trying to get a diverse range of samples so that we could get a sense of different types of activities, different types of assessments that academics were using in their courses, and different ways that the LMS were used. And of course those case studies went across those 3 institutions of the University of Melbourne, Macquarie University and the University of South Australia.
And we had, from memory, didn't we, Linda, sort of different size classes, trying to work that out?
We did. We had a very complicated matrix of different disciplines, different institutions, and different class sizes. So I think 2 of the cases had very small class sizes of less than 50 students. There were 5 or 6 cases that were sort of medium, from anything from about 80 up to 200, and then the rest were large classes of 200 plus. We didn't have any really big classes in this first sample, but we have certainly in previous studies talked to people who have very large classes and found very similar kind of wants and needs, but also those concerns about actually dealing with the data once they get it.
So Astrid says, do you think, or did you find that they wanted more sophisticated analytics once they know what's possible, or once they are more aware of the analytics in general? I don't know if you want to respond to that, Linda.
Yes. I mean, one of the problems that we had, and one of the problems we've had not only in this study, but also a previous study that we did with academic staff around their wants and needs of learning analytics, is that when you ask people about learning analytics, they really don't understand what it is, and they're not quite sure what's possible. And it was one of the reasons Gregor mentioned before that we gave them some examples and we got them to reflect on the examples. We didn't find so much that they wanted like substantially more sophisticated analytics after seeing the examples, but often seeing a different type of analytics or seeing what was possible would prompt them and say, well, look, I don't need this for my class, but something like this that would tell me something else would be quite useful. So, for example, social network analysis was something that a lot of the academics looked at and were a little bit scared by because they were seeing lots of dots and lines and quite complicated visualizations. And when we talked with them about what sorts of things these visualizations could be used for, they would say, well, look, I don't use a discussion forum, but that would actually be really useful to think about how my students are working in collaborative learning activities within wikis, for example.
Megan also asks, what is your definition of sophisticated versus basic analytics? So I think that's a really good question. We're using it fairly loosely here. I suppose that when I was talking before, what I was thinking, Megan, was that basic analytics are really those kind of analytics that talk to you about access, whether or not somebody has clicked on something or downloaded something. Basic analytics sort of refer to log on, log off type activities and access activities. When I start thinking about sophisticated analytics, I'd be interested in other people's sort of opinions. I'm thinking about both more sophisticated statistical techniques that you might use with analytics and also more sophisticated learning design, so analytics that are down at the micro level of the learning design. So the best example I can think of there is that if you set a collaborative writing task with students, maybe using a wiki or something like that, is accessing the wiki pages might be fairly basic analytics. But if you do any cluster analysis or aggregation techniques that looks across a number of words written, the ways in which students are using comments, the degree to which they're contributing across time, maybe using some sequential analytics, things like Markov chain modeling, you start to build up profiles and patterns of students' engagement with the task that allow you to discriminate between groups of students. And that's a little bit more sophisticated in terms of your analysis and the ways in which you think about whether or not that task is, in inverted commas, working, compared to basic analytics about just action and time on task. Does that answer the question? He says waiting. Asterisks ticking. So we might move on, Matthew, and see what the next slide. So after using the first phase to sort of drive or provide information for this second phase of the project, what we then went about doing is developing a web-based tool, which is what Anisha helped us with. So the idea behind this tool was to take data sets from the two most common learning management systems in the Australian context, which are Moodle and Blackboard, and suck data, develop a tool that was able to suck data out of subject sites or unit sites within those learning management systems and provide it into a tool that would then provide data sets, data visualization, data displays back to the academic staff member. And we'll take you through what we've developed in a second, or Linda will. In addition to that, what we call the learning analytics part of the tool, we also wanted a pedagogical helper tool with, again, the intent of the project was to make sure that we didn't see these behavioural analytics or learning analytics just in isolation. We wanted to try and find a way that we could support staff in thinking about the pedagogical intent behind their courses, the kinds of objectives, activities and technology-based tools they use, and so use that to frame their inquiry with whatever data was extracted using the learning analytics tool. So that's the idea behind this tool development. Next slide, Matt. So now I hand over to Linda, and she can tell you a little bit about what we've done and the kinds of screenshots that we're going to show you today about the Loop tool.
Great, thanks, Gregor. So as Gregor said, there's sort of two elements to this tool, and I'm going to take you through the learning analytics element, and then Gregor will speak a little bit after that about the pedagogical intent, the pedagogical helper tool. But this is the course dashboard that you're seeing at the moment, which when an academic logs in, this is the view that they first see for their subject or unit or course. I'm going to use the word subject for now. But obviously you might have different terminology within your institutions. I'm also going to try and use this little pointy hand thing. Can people see my pointy hand? Matt, can you see that? Can you give me some feedback there? Yes? Okay, thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so this is the this is the course dashboard that, as I said, that the academics will see when they first log in. It basically provides a summary of the different types of metrics and data within the tool, a very sort of one quick glance summary. So the page views here gives information about the content, communication, assessment, and unique pages that students have viewed. In this particular case, the students have looked at content only for this course. And what we've also tried to do throughout the tool, and Gregor talked about it very early on when we were talking about the timeliness and the time dimension within analytics, is that we wanted to be able to show how this data sort of changes over time and how it also changes in relation to instructional events. So as you can see in this page view graph at the top here, there's the instructional event of a lecture. And what we've done is we've built into this tool the ability to add in as many instructional events as you'd like. So it might be that you have a weekly lecture or multiple weekly lectures. You may have tutorials. It could be a one-off event like an assessment task being due. It could be a one-off instructional event like a guest speaker or a field trip, any of those sorts of things. So we wanted to be able to show the patterns of access within the LMS to certain elements, as said, content, communication, assessment in relation to those events. The week metrics section, oh, and sorry, I should say also, if you've got any questions as we go through, please throw them into the text box there. Oh, Megan has one. No, Gregor's talking, sorry. Okay. Right, so the week metrics gives just a very, very broad overview of these different elements around the unique page views, the number of students. And you can't see this in a static screenshot, but if you were to hover your mouse over any of those particular graphs, it would give you more information, including the numbers that those graphs represent. The student page views histogram just gives you a bit of a sense of how many, and unfortunately I can't scroll down in the screenshot, but you will see a little bit more of that screen in a moment. It gives you a histogram so you can see if there are any general trends about how often students are going in. So at the moment you can't see along the bottom there, but it's saying that, you know, I think roughly 45 or so students have gone in, I think 1 or 2 times to see different page views within your LMS site. And on the bottom right-hand corner is the top access content, so you can see the resources within your LMS site that are being used the most often. So this particular representation of the dashboard relates to week 1 of semester, and so you have the ability to change to whichever week that you are in, and you can look just in a week view, or else there is the ability to look at your entire course throughout the semester. So Matt, if we could go to the next slide. This is what happens if you put all in. And so we just changed that visualization at the top of the dashboard a little bit, and you can see throughout the entire semester, oh, I've lost my little finger, here we go. You can see throughout the entire semester the access or the page views. And as you can see in this particular visualization, there are more key instructional events that you can have a look at. So it's the usual kind of pattern that you often see in learning management systems, where there's a lot of activity at the beginning of the semester and it tends to trail off a little bit towards the end. All the same information is available in terms of the histogram and also the top access content, but now it's talking about the content for the entire semester, not just for that particular week. And if you scroll down, so Matt, if we could go to the next slide, there's also a few more boxes which we didn't show you on that first one, but you can also see which students have been accessing the site most frequently. And also, oh sorry, I should be clicking on these things so you can see. Lost my hand again. There we go. And also the communication tool access. So if your learning management system site has a discussion forum or multiple discussion forums, there'll be information in this box about how many unique students have viewed this, and also how many times these discussion forums have been viewed. And we also have information around the assessment access. So that's how many times the students have accessed the different assessment sections within your learning management system, and also the average student scores in those assessments. One of the things that we wanted to do when we first started looking at building this tool was to bring in some third-party assessment software, things like Turnitin, but we discovered that within the scope and the budget of our project that wasn't possible at this stage. But one of the things that we have done is we've made this tool open source, so we're hoping that further development by hopefully ourselves, but also other people around the world might be able to build in those sorts of integrations. So next slide please, Matt. Great. So for what we also did is we set up 3 different areas within the LMS. And I need to make my thing go the other way. Wait a minute. There we go. So in this course access section, which is the section of the tool that we're now in, we've set it up with 3 different subsections. One around content, the other around communication, and the third around assessment. So the screen we're looking at the moment is the one about content. And what we can see here are all the folders and resource files within a learning management system site and the number of page access views. So if we look at the top here, we're actually looking at page views at the moment. And we can see how many page views, how many hits each of these sections have had. Now, one of the challenges that we had in setting up the tool was that we wanted it to work with both Blackboard and Moodle. And so we had to work out a way to sort of bring the architecture of those sites into the tool. What we have found is because every academic sets up their learning management system site slightly differently, it was difficult to sort of be able to classify these in ways that would make sense. So we've basically just had to pull the architecture in as it is in the learning management system. So if you've got a very neatly set up learning management system site, your table will look a lot neater than someone who doesn't have a very neatly set up. And we'll get back to that in a bit when we talk about assessment. But one of the things that made us realize is that a lot of academics don't build their learning management system sites from scratch every year. They kind of roll them over from previous years. And what we find is that a lot of old material tends to stick around, and that does clutter up and make these graphs a little bit more difficult to read. So as you can see here in this dummy course that we've set up, the How Much Do We Drink survey, which is this one here, has no views, and that's probably because it's not used in the course anymore, but it's still part of the learning management system site. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also at the top here, so this, as I said, this page view is this table is of the page views. You also have the ability to look at the unique number of students. So if you know that you have, say, 200 students in your course, you could change this view so that you can see how many of those 200 students have looked at each of these different resources across those weeks. We also have an events section, and I'll leave that for now, and I'll come back to that when we get to the communication section, and I'll show you what that looks like. So yes, so this is the content section. So Matt, if we can go to the next slide. Any of those content items, you can drill down into an individual item and have a look at more detail. So I've just picked one particular item called top, and I've looked at the access to this particular item over the semester. Also, if you have a look here at the this section of the graph here, you can actually change the date range to whichever date you would like. So you don't have to look at the full semester. You can look at just a single week or a number of months, whichever you'd like, and you can move these the edges of these to change the date range, and click on this button, and it will update everything on this page that relates to this particular resource. So if we were to scroll down, so Matt, if we can go to the next slide, for the individual resource, we also get a list of students who haven't viewed that resource. So this could be quite useful if it's a core resource that students need to look at, for example, for an assessment, and it's quite key that the students access this resource, and perhaps you could get a list of those students who haven't accessed it and email those students if you're a little bit concerned about them. We've included the email just there so that it's a really simple copy and paste across into your email program to be able to communicate with the students. Are there any questions at this point before we go on? I'm taking silence as a no. I'll give you a bit of time to type. So, not from me, not from you. Okay, thanks, Gregor. All right, Matt, we'll go to the next slide and we'll keep on going. But as you say, as we said before, if there's anything, there's a message from Kirsten. Is it available for use by others? The tool itself, I'm assuming you're meaning there, and it will be available once we've finished our piloting. It will be made open source so that institutions can adopt it, but Gregor will speak more about that a bit later on. Sally is asking, can you combine info at a student level? No, not in the current version of the tool, but it is something that we did work into our requirements when we were first building it. But again, the scope and the budget didn't allow us to go to that level of detail. We'd like to be able to allow you to group students in that way, but also to group resources in that way. So that's something for the future. All right, so I'll come back to questions in a little bit because I'm just conscious that we want to keep to time. The slide that you're seeing in front of you now is the communication section. So we looked at content before, and now we're looking at communication. So communication basically within an LMS refers to discussion forums. So in this table you're seeing a row for every discussion forum that exists. And then you're seeing the page accesses for those discussion forums. Again, we've got different options at the top here. At the moment, you're looking at page views. You could also look at this table in terms of posts. You could also look at the unique students who've looked at these particular discussion forums. And again, events, I'll come back to that one in a moment. But one of the things that we noticed when we were building this tool is that not everything is very straightforward in terms of what they mean. So as the academic, you would probably know what the names of these forums are, for example, but it struck us that we weren't quite sure what all forums meant, but that's something that automatically comes through from Blackboard and from Moodle. So what we've tried to do, and Matt, if you can go to the next slide, is that we've built in some support text to be able to help people to interpret some of these rows and columns. So in this case, it's the page that has all of the links to the discussion forum. However, in the design of the course that we've taken this data from, they didn't use that page to put students towards the discussion forum. The discussion forum links were built into other elements within the learning management system. So I'm just going to pause for one moment because I've just noticed there's a lot of questions coming through. So Leslie's asked, does the tool pick up groups and groupings? Not at the moment, but again, that's something for our future development. And oh wow, there's lots of things coming through now. It'd be nice if the resource could be adopted by individuals. Yes, it's a challenge at the moment because it doesn't to be an institutional thing, and that's mainly because you need to be able to get exports of the data from the back end of your learning management system to feed into the tool. So it's not something that an individual academic can work with at the moment. Oh, but that's what Paula's just said. Sorry, I didn't read that bit. All right, great. I'll keep moving on, and then we can come back to those questions as we go through. So yes, so we tried to build in help text wherever we can, just to help with the interpretation, because we are aware that academics are a little bit concerned about how difficult that may be. So before I mentioned that we have an events tab in the content, communication and assessment section, and the events tab looks a little bit different to the table views here. Oh, sorry, and I should also mention, for any of the individual forums, you can click on the view button and you can see a summary of just the activity within that particular forum. But the events tab, as we were talking about here, Matt, if we go to the next slide, looks a little bit like this. And the idea behind the Events tab is that you want to be looking at students' access to a particular resource or to a particular communication or assessment tool in relation to an instructional event. So in this case, the event that we're looking at is the Tuesday lecture. And so for each week, we can see whether the students have been accessing the information or the resources, or in this case, sorry, the communication, discussion forums, either before or after that lecture. So if the blue section of the graph shows that the students have accessed this discussion forum before the weekly lecture, and the red section shows that they've accessed this forum after the weekly lecture. The size of the circle, sort of varying from very small through to quite large, is an indication of the number of views that that particular forum has had in that week. All right, so moving on now. The assessment section here, again, shows you a tabular version of the assessment sections in terms of, within the LMS, of the areas where students can go and submit their assessments. So as you can see here in this table, there's been a lot of activity on those assessment pages to do with this first assessment item here, but not so much activity for the other assessment items. And we were a little bit confused by this, so we went and had a look at this particular site in a little bit more detail. And when we actually looked at how many assessment items existed within the LMS site, and this is a Blackboard LMS site, we realized that this academic had experimented a lot with different forms of assessment, but had, after every experiment, had left the material there. So Matt, if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that this is just a snapshot, and I couldn't actually take a screenshot that included everything because there were so many, of how many assessment items were listed for this particular site. And as I said before, it's the reason that because he's developed new assessment items but left the old ones there, it makes it quite cluttered. So it's one of the things that we would need to educate academics about if they were going to be using a tool such as this, to try and really keep your learning management system site as clean as possible to make this tool as usable as possible. So moving on, Matt? Okay. So within the assessment section, there are lots of other views that you can look at in terms of grades, and you can also look at how students have looked at the assessment or submitted assessments in relation to instructional events as well. So this next section relates to the students. So we have information on individual students. And this is a section where I think some of those questions earlier relating to groups is where we need to do a little bit more development. So for each student, you get a bit of a sense of their page views in this particular view throughout the semester. And we've done a little bit of a heat map type of visualization here so that you can see students, so the darker squares here, so for example, this student here, they did a lot of page views in week 7, which is interesting because I believe that was semester break. But then obviously there are students who have no page views in particular weeks, and the squares are lighter. If you'd like to investigate any students in particular, you can click on the view button for any student, and Matt, if you move to the next slide. That takes you to, again, a very similar view to what you can see for content items, for communication items, and also for assessment items. You get a sense of what that student has done throughout the semester in terms of page views and their access and interaction with the learning management system. You can see how often they have contributed to course communication. So for this particular student, we can see they've looked at some of the discussion forums, but they haven't actually posted anything in those discussion forums. And then we have the course assessment section, so we can have a look at the different assessments that they've done, how many attempts they've made, and the average score that they have across those attempts. So that is a whirlwind tour of the tool, but we knew that time was going to prevent us from going into any more detail than that just at this moment. But there's a lot more to it. There are a lot of other views, but this is what we can show you for now. I want to leave some time to hand back to Gregor so that he can talk about the pedagogical helper tool, which will help integrate some of this data and some of these frequencies with the pedagogical intent behind the class activities. So Gregor, over to you.
Thanks, Linda. I know that Kirsten has just asked about whether or not it can capture stuff that's outside the LMS, and I'd have to admit that that makes my brain hurt. So it doesn't at the moment, but I know that there's quite a bit of interest in that kind of activity, recognising that there's plenty of activity that students engage in, which is learning activity, that's outside the LMS. I noticed we've got a question about can we gain access to the tool and test it out. It will be eventually an open source tool. We're just going through the final pilot test at the moment, and we expect that it will be available next year. Paula says, can the tool breakdowns check how students perform in different sections of the assessment? I don't quite understand that question. Maybe Linda, I'm not sure.
Yes, no, not at the moment. At the moment, it's only looking at the submission of the assessment and the views of the assessment information. This is what we were referring to before about wanting to build in the third-party tools and further detail within the learning management systems around the assessment. But certainly in future plans, but it doesn't do that at the moment. Can I actually just go back and answer Matthew's question from earlier about whether or not you can hide items? That is actually a feature of the tool, but we were having some bug issues with it, so we've turned it off for the moment, but it's something that we will build in at some point. So you will be able to kind of hide all of those messy parts of your LMS site, I guess is what you're referring to there.
Super. Have you used LAMS to do some data analytics? And the answer is no. I know about LAMS, but we haven't used that in this scenario. I might move on to where we're headed next, given that time we're getting close to the hour. I'm being distracted by Megan's question, which is, in your study, how many action to close the loop of the data? We've just finished, Megan, the interviews, the post semester interviews with the staff that trialled the tool. I don't think that we've got the data analysed for that yet, but watch this space. We'll have that data for you in the new year. As Paula says, we're interviewing them this week. So the second phase was the development of a web-based tool. A pedagogical helper tool is the thing that we're working on at the moment, where I've mentioned this before, where we're connecting asking staff to enter the learning outcomes associated with a particular subject or unit. We ask them to do a matching exercise where they connect those outcomes with activities and assessment. We then ask them to say what kind of technologies they're using to support those, so very much a constructive alignment kind of approach to this. And then once they've developed this one-to-many map between outcomes, activities, assessments and technology-based tools, they're able to capture that for either just as a PDF in the system or to print out, and use that then to think about the ways in which they might use that to inform the kinds of analytics that they're seeking to gather out of the tool. Matt? So this is really a wireframe of where we're headed. We're developing this actively at the moment. I think we'll have our prototype of this before Christmas, where learning outcomes to activity assessment and then technology-based tools. So it's fairly simple at the moment, but hopefully it looks a little bit prettier when we actually come to develop it. Right. So where we are in the third phase of the project, we're just about to enter that phase where, as we just mentioned before, looking to analyse the pilot data from the tests that we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 months, and then develop that pedagogical support tool, pedagogical helper tool, up to the end of the year this year. Use the analysis of what we've learnt thus far to review the tool and tweak it, and then into the dissemination phase of the project. Matt. So what we hope to produce, and we've said we'll produce for the OLT who's funding this work, is that we'll, out of the 3 phases of the project, come up with a tool that we've showed you today. There'll be a framework that explains, because it's open source, we'll provide the code and provide the annotation on that code, the commenting on that code, and a technical framework associated with implementation. We're set to run a series of workshops around what we've learnt from the project, sort of generally about tying analytics to pedagogical intent, and also the ways in which the practicalities of the tool work. Capture that kind of those kind of things in a handbook that we'll release to the academic, to the sector here. We've already started publishing academic papers out of this, a final report to the OLT, and the pervasive website. Now, there's the website. That's just posted the website there. We've said that we'll try and finish 5 minutes to the hour, or 7 minutes to the hour. So thank you for listening, and happy to take any questions via the chat box over the next couple of minutes, unless there's anything Paula or Linda want to add at this stage.
Not to add, but just to respond to Megan's question, it's quite straightforward to set up those assessment dates. So it's just something that you can do at the beginning of semester and put all of the dates in, or else we're working at the moment to enable academics to be able to go in and customise those dates and add to those dates. In one of the interviews that we have done this week so far, that was some feedback we received from the academic, is that they would like to be able to have the flexibility to add and perhaps change those dates. He had a scenario where for some administrative reasons they had to extend the deadline on an assessment, and so therefore he needed to change the date within the tool to be able to reflect that. Right, what have we got? Does it pull assessment dates from the LMS? No, it doesn't pull assessment dates from the LMS at the moment. You do need to enter those in separately. Does the tool have a name? Yes. It's called Loop. Can any of the data be exported? Yes, there is the ability to export some data. There's also the ability to print and export some of the visualizations from the dashboards and from the reports within the tool.
Sally's saying she has to go, and suggest another webinar when the pedagogical helper tool is developed. And we're happy to share the data from how academics use it. So, yep, happy to respond to that.
Yep. What testing of the tool undergone with Moodle HQ? None. Unfortunately, Sally, to your question, but we did speak. Martin Douglas was at the presentation that we gave on this tool last week in Perth, and he was quite keen to have a chat with us to see how our tool can work with Moodle.
Any other questions from folks before we wrap up the session and hand back to Matt?
Great.
Okay, Matt, over to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Gregor, Linda, Tara, etc. I'm just going to paste in the link so it's live. Please fill in our feedback survey, as I say at the end of each of these sessions. This was a very lively session, so Gregor and team, yes, I'll be happy to have you back next year when you're ready, perhaps later in the year next year, to talk about the pedagogical helper tool, if you're willing and able to have another go.
No problem.
Cool. Otherwise, we're almost done, so I can stop the recording here. If there's no last-minute questions, as I said, remember to fill in the feedback survey. That would be fantastic.
Did we just have a quick hand up there? That's all someone put their hand up. Yeah. Thanks, AP, for the applause.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, everyone's gone shy now.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, Gregor, and thank you, Linda, and thank you, Paula. That was very wonderful. A wonderful end to the year's webinar series. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
No worries, Matt.